everyone, Owen here, and 2016 was a somewhat strange time in the history of the internet culture wars. Obviously, this stemmed in part from the fact that, in America at least, it was also a strange time in the culture wars of more real life. Political parties were shifting, people were being pushed to political extremes for a variety of factors, and the country was as polarized as it had ever been. But I'd say that this strangeness was also, to a degree, because the anti-feminists and anti-SJWs, the frontliners and in many cases primary broadcasters of the online anti-PC movement Gamergate, were beginning to face a crisis of identity. See, ever since the in-earnest beginning of the controversy and campaigns of harassment that launched the movement in 2014, one of the main tenets of Gamergate had been the pretense that grave concern with the ethical standards and practices of the games journalism industry was their main focus, both in general and in their specific responses to and coverage of Gamergate itself. Despite the fact that, even at the time, this claim was largely dismissed, and rightfully so, by opponents of the movement as nothing more than a disingenuous attempt to retroactively present some justification for the abhorrent actions they took, they kept that pretense up for some time, well past the point that you'd think it would still be useful. Now, I'm not here to speculate on whether or not they really believed this, or if it was a calculated lie, what the purpose might have been. Was it to convince the general public, potential recruits to the movement, just to troll? Frankly, I don't care one way or the other, or the other, or the other, or the other. The interesting thing here isn't how or why this lie started, it's how it was ended. As Gamergate and the culture around it had been developing across the internet, another movement had begun to gain popularity, the alt-right. Although the idea of an alternative right had existed since the late 2000s with white nationalist Richard Spencer, it had only begun to truly take hold from 2014 onward on, you guessed it, the internet, emerging even in many of the same places that Gamergate was. The two movements, Gamergate and the alt-right, were very closely linked, both in membership and ideology, and by the US presidential election of 2016, this relationship had become long-term and serious, to the degree that many major figures of Gamergate were becoming figures of the alt-right, and with this shift to a more explicitly and honestly right-wing position came a shift into expression of and focus on more explicitly and honestly right-wing politics, notably in their push for the election of now President Donald Trump. For many subscribers to the original Gamergate movement, then, this presented a choice: to take the plunge into the right or to distance themselves from the movement. Or, at least, one would think that those would be the only two options. And, I mean, it makes sense, right? If it's become clear that your movement that you thought started as simple concerns over ethics and journalism has largely become, and likely always was to a degree, in my most generous interpretation, a mouthpiece for the talking points of the far right, you probably wouldn't want to stick around too long if those ideas were repulsive to you. And to be fair to those who deserve it, many individuals who were involved in Gamergate did leave around this time, and most of those who stayed can probably be inferred to have almost always been basically on board with the much uglier ideas that the movement eventually hit, at least transparently. But, between those who left and those who stayed, there was a third group, those for whom Gamergate never really changed. To some people, the marriage of the alt-right and much of Gamergate's old guard didn't fundamentally change what Gamergate was. People for whom anti-SJW and anti-feminist were still, and always were, apolitical terms. Where I might see the merging of the alt-right and Gamergate as something revealing of the underlying nature of the movement all along, it didn't seem like this group thought that it recontextualized anything. Or they knew it did all along even, and simply didn't care. But regardless of the why of this situation, what this meant was that the internet was left with a group of Gamergaters who hadn't moved on to the more mainstream political wing of the far right, as well as a fair number of those who had but were still interested in the internet culture wars, all of whom were, with widespread controversy around early targets such as Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn largely nothing more than memories, looking for something to do. And it's not that hard to find things to get mad about as an anti-SJW, so they found a lot of things. But today, I want to talk about one very specific thing that they found, and that thing is Zelda and pronouns. On July 7th, 2017, a post was made to the Zelda Wiki subforum on fansite zeldauniverse.net by Tony, ZU's wiki editor-in-chief, entitled Shift in Focus, Gender versus Pronouns. In this relatively lengthy post, they outlined the reasoning behind, benefits of, and implementation plan for the changing of the Zelda Wiki to include a pronouns field in character descriptions instead of a gender one, as was the case at the time. Listed as a primary benefit of this decision was the fact that it was, from the perspective of maintaining an accurate and factual wiki, more, well, accurate, in that, in most cases, the game won't outright tell you the gender of a character, and so, in labeling characters with gender, inference is often required. And despite certain claims that this decision was ideological and applying real-world ideas onto a fictional context where they didn't make sense, the idea that pronouns aren't necessarily representative of gender is something which is already, as this post explains, a thing in Zelda. Fi, a character from 2011's Skyward Sword, is referred to with she/her pronouns, but has been confirmed by the series producer, Eiji Aonuma, to not be female. A gender field, then, would either have to accurately label gender but leave an incorrect assumption for pronouns, or use an incorrect gender in order to match the character's correct pronouns. However, here using a pronouns field would remove the necessity for actual or implied incorrect information. Another example is Sheik from 1998's Ocarina of Time, a character who is an alter ego of Zelda and confirmed to be female, but is still referred to by he/him pronouns within the game. With the gender field, the wiki is forced to then make the decision to cover the character from the perspective of the persona of Sheik, or from that of Sheik simply as being Zelda. Once again, however, a pronouns field would solve this dilemma, allowing for a more nuanced explanation of the character to be kept to the main body of the article. These examples, among others, were presented by the editor-in-chief as a significant enough reason to implement the new policy, the process for which was explained to be relatively brief, only taking several days. The post ended with a request for feedback, asking that those providing it be clear about either support or opposition to the decision. Important to note, though, is that this was not a vote, contrary to the claims of some opponents of the decision in its aftermath. As Tony told me in an interview I conducted with them, I created a thread on the Zelda Universe Forums to discuss this change, and I wanted to engage with the community to help build our user base and get feedback on the decision. This was back during the early days of our policy process, and we only had a few policy threads before that one, so I didn't set a strict poll to find hard numbers. And this wasn't the only misinformation out there. As I alluded to earlier, this change prompted a swift response from many parts of the internet, most notably on the primary Zelda subreddit and two anti-SJW subreddits, Tumblr in Action and the site's main Gamergate affiliated subreddit, Kotaku in Action. Those last two presumably because they ran out of unethical games journalism to complain about. A common theme across several of these posts was that the poster, alongside their thoughts on the matter or some sort of provocative question, would include a screenshot of a character bio box, presumably the one where they first noticed the change. I have to make this assumption mostly because, as opposed to what I would assume someone would do if they were trying to elicit a strong negative reaction about this, being to use a well-known character like Link or Zelda to illustrate the change, they instead selected some very strange choices. A small number of these have explanations, but others don't, which makes the selections all the more funny. For example, this Tumblr in Action poster who used the pirate Zuko from 2001's The Wind Waker, a character who is objectively the fourth best pirate at best, and this other poster on the same subreddit who used everyone's favorite character, Groose of 2011's Skyward Sword fame, as their example for the collapse of society. Why were these people browsing these pages at random? Who knows? Of course, I can't prove that this guy checked the page for Groose every day on the Zelda Wiki just to make sure it listed him as male still, but you also can't prove that they didn't. And the funniest thing about this is that, while I earlier said that if I was the one trying to stir up angry gamer feelings, I'd probably use a character I thought people cared about, because, you know, they care about it more, but the people in the comments on these posts reacted to it like their political ideology was always largely based on making sure an internet site told you Groos's gender in the way they liked. The way they talk, Groos is the one thing standing between the sanctity of Western civilization and anarchy, where Antifa protesters will beat you up in the streets if you disagree with them about fan wiki policy. A political concept I like to call the thin Groos line. We are at any given moment this close to the total collapse of society, and this pointy-haired video game character is the only thing gluing the fabric of our fragile state of being together. The only legitimate state is Groosland, don't at me. Anyway, people also had some weirdly strong opinions to express about how they were using the alternative to the Zelda Wiki, Zeldapedia, before everyone learned how the Zelda Wiki staff were all Marxists who spend their time bullying hardworking Americans, which, like, that's cool, guys. You really showed them by anticipating the fact that you would get mad at them? Whatever. As is standard for these kinds of things, a lot of people had a lot of different and often contradictory thoughts on the actual thing being advocated for here. One original thread poster on the r/Zelda subreddit suggested that no one gives a shit about pronouns, which, sure, I guess they can't prove that people do care, but I feel like with that kind of thing, the burden of proof that they don't falls on the people who have made a half-dozen threads about it with hundreds of comments each. Also, even if it were the case that people didn't care, it's not like the wiki staff is abducting innocent Gamergaters to use as a labor force to make these changes for them. They're doing it. It's their job to fix things that people don't care that much about and get caught up on small details. As the editor-in-chief told me, I think most of the large-scale decisions have either been cosmetic or structural, such as the media template in the info boxes on most pages allowing readers to switch between images of a subject, or a template that checks terminology in relation to specific games to spit out the most accurate name for something in any game. And to be clear, that stuff is not meaningless, even if most of you probably didn't understand what it meant. Those are very useful resources for users to have, and they increase the accuracy and flow of information on the wiki. But that's also true of the pronouns change. Compared to the kind of work that the wiki staff generally does, this is pretty meaningful to a relatively large number of people. The assertion was also made that this move was done to please a certain group of people, which, firstly, is something exceedingly easy to claim but much more difficult to prove. As long as it's perceived that a certain group would like any given decision, you can pretty easily make the claim that it was done to appease them in some way, the implication being here that this is in order to benefit oneself off of their perception of your wokeness or something. For a decision like this, though, it's a weird position to be in, claiming someone made it in order to be made more popular or well-liked, while also turning on them your community built on publicly and vitriolically attacking people like them. Tony told me, I knew that people would be mad at me for something along the lines of trying to push SJW politics, but I didn't anticipate Reddit and 4chan communities smelling blood and sending me violent images over Twitter for months after the fact. I had to just leave the internet for a while until people found something else to talk about. That doesn't exactly sound like someone going into a decision with the impression that they would be made popular through it. While there existed a number of people in the announcement thread for the change who were supportive of it, they were much less interested in repeat posting to express their approval than those who disapproved were with repeat posting to express that, so the actual average of individual posts were vastly weighed in favor of disapproval. If Tony was going for an ego boost, they definitely failed in that. At one point in the thread, a group even gets mad at the webmaster of Zelda Universe for not stepping in to stop, the wiki from enacting policy. A wiki team that ZU had hired to do just that. They're claiming that the editor-in-chief, a person completely within their authority to make decisions that they did, is being authoritarian, and then immediately turning around to ask a higher-up to use their power to stop someone from doing something that they have a personal issue with. Now, I'm not saying that I think that's authoritarian. I'm just saying that if Tony was doing something closer affiliated with the right wing, and the webmaster stepped in, they'd sure think it was. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that in researching for this video in the Kotaku in Action thread, I scrolled down a bit just to see what the comments were saying, and without realizing found myself several comments deep in a debate about, which user was a poser metalhead? I have absolutely no idea how they turned on each other so quickly, though I'm not necessarily surprised, why this subject is what did it, or how they even got into it on a thread about the Zelda Wiki, but it's really beautiful, and I hope that this video memorializes one of the most epic battles of intellect in recorded history. While this is easily the most off-topic comment thread, it's shockingly not the most out there, a title proudly claimed by the person claiming that Japan has no robust concept of gender politics. Okay. Anyway, a bit ago I mentioned the claim that there was some sort of a vote associated with this decision, and one of the main places that this idea was presented was the Kotaku in Action comments, specifically this highly upvoted one. This comment thread was actually made nearly a year after the initial controversy, so surely this individual had a lot of time to fact check and make sure that they were accurately representing the situation. Of course, this is a Gamergate forum, obviously they didn't do that. Anyway, since this post has a lot of claims all in one place, and since it seems to have at least somewhat influenced the opinions of a lot of other people on them, I thought we'd take a look just to see what kinds of issues were generally being taken here. So, this post makes a number of claims, but what we'll do is just go through the whole thing in one go, and then work our way back through to respond to it. As it says, apparently the way it went was someone complained about pronouns because they are like, Sheik identifies as a male, so we gotta do proper pronouns. Well, a mod decided to humor her request by posting a poll about whether Zelda Wiki about whether they should change it or not, and the poll wound up winning 5 in favor, 4 against. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, not exactly. The poll was placed in a very low traffic subforum that was unrelated to the subject, and the mod who ran the poll invalidated one vote and changed another from against to for cause they said it was too vague, in spite of the person who voted later saying the vote was against. Oh, and any threads complaining about the vote were to be locked. Starting with this post's account of the origins of this decision, problematic to it is the fact that it is, as far as I have been able to discern through my research, entirely fabricated. The individual claimed to have motivated this decision doesn't seem to actually exist. There is no evidence of any thread or discussion on the Zelda Universe Forums, or posts on either the Zelda Universe or Zelda Wiki Discord servers to this effect. Furthermore, the direct testimony of the editor-in-chief directly contradicts the story. The proposal itself didn't come about until summer of 2016, but I was grappling with my own gender identity around 2015, and in that time I started looking into certain characters like Fi from Skyward Sword and Sheik from Ocarina of Time, and realized that you can't really discern what someone's gender is by their pronouns. Acknowledging what the developers have said about certain characters, it's easy to recognize that both within this fantasy world and the real world, you don't inherently know what anyone's actual gender is, even by their pronouns alone. You can make assumptions, but those aren't necessarily rooted in fact. Since looking at the series through a purely factual lens is more or less Zelda Wiki's goal, I wanted to have us shift how we looked at characters to not make those assumptions. A bit later, they make the claim that a moderator, presumably Tony by the detail that they were the one to open the thread, was influenced by this made-up individual to post a poll. But interestingly, Tony wasn't a moderator at that point in 2016, and as a matter of fact, never was. And this bit is a little weird, especially for someone who's trying to accurately represent the situation, but I think I'll give this person the benefit of the doubt and assume that they're just referring to Zelda Wiki staff as moderators. Even if it's inaccurate, it's not terribly so, since the Zelda Wiki staff is Zelda Universe staff, and Wiki staff technically has limited moderator power over the Zelda Wiki subforum. But it's an important distinction because it lends a degree of credibility to the decision that the author of this post doesn't. It wasn't some random forum moderator or low-level wiki staff member humoring someone's request. It was a decision being handed down directly from the wiki staff, the highest position on that staff to be exact. Anyway, the next claims are even more strange. For one, it obviously once again makes the incorrect claim that what was posted was a poll or a vote of some sort, but then it also says that the poll was placed in a very low-traffic subforum that was unrelated to the subject, which is weird, considering it was the Zelda Wiki subforum. I think it's pretty obvious that it's hard to get more related to the subject than that. It's possible that this was, at a time, in a different subforum and then moved at a later point, but since the author of this post didn't mention where it was, it's difficult to tell. Through a little forum detective work, however, we can see that the wiki subforum has existed in its current state since September of 2014, and that the thread for the gender to pronouns change is listed in correct chronology with the posts around it, which would not be the case had it been moved at a later point, suggesting that it was there to begin with. So, yeah, this is inaccurate, but so what? What does it tell us about the message of the person writing it, and what they're trying to get the audience of their post to believe? For this specific set of claims, about the origins of the decision, and about the wiki subforum being a low traffic and unrelated to the subject, I think the goal is obviously to start early in building up the case that this entire process was, from the beginning, illegitimate. In a second, we're going to talk about the claim that the quote-unquote voting process for the decision was manipulated, and while that's something a lot of people get caught up on, both on the forums and off, it was really only ever presented in a way that, implied or explicitly, suggested it was only a facet of something that was as a whole deceptive, manipulative, and, once again, and most importantly, illegitimate. And speaking of that voting process manipulation, the author here has a more direct explanation than for previous parts of the controversy, explaining both that the votes of certain individuals were changed or discounted if they were in opposition to this decision. But again, this wasn't a vote, and while some discussion of the specific opinions presented did occur in the follow-up thread Gender v Pronouns, it was again limited to account of those who had expressed an opinion for or against. Even if that wasn't the case though, the claims are still inaccurate. Looking at the thread, while a number of users expressed questioning as to the reasoning behind the decision, only 5 responded in the explicit way requested, with 3 for and 2 against. While one user in that follow-up thread counted 4 for and 6 against, and Tony counted 5 for and 4 against, both counts are overly generous in their interpretation of posts that were questioning of the decision as opposed votes, when the majority of them did not vote in the way requested in the OP. Speaking of that follow-up thread, that brings us to our last claim of this post, that any posts criticizing the decision were deleted. Interesting thing though, that follow-up thread was critical, and yet it came to be the main thread for discussion at the time it was posted. Both this thread and even the original announcement thread, which was brigaded by users hurling homophobic epithets, were allowed to remain open. There exists no direct evidence of this mass silencing outside of the anecdote of individuals we've already shown to be untrustworthy, and even if it were the case that other threads were trashed, it would have been because they were brigading or redundant to the threads already in place, as administrators freely allowed dissenting opinions on the aforementioned threads, with only 3 posts being deleted between them, all of which were intentionally offensive or attacking the character of the staff members involved. Together, this post's claims are really interesting to me. On the one hand, it's very reminiscent of previous counters to the decision that we've already talked about, trying to attack the idea itself. But for the majority of its allotted text, it goes a step further, attempting to not just invalidate the decision, but also the circumstances, motivations, and importantly, individuals behind it. It wasn't enough to say that this idea was bad. The person who did it had to be bad. The system which allowed it to happen had to be bad also. And it gets to be a pretty mask-off moment, people openly mocking the gender identity of the editor-in-chief, searching for alleged dirt on their political leanings as we saw, even fabricating entire backstories to make them appear ineffectual, easily influenced, or a fierce ideologue, depending on whichever happened to be most useful at the time. And I know that it doesn't really count as being mask-off if the group's entire identity is based on this exact kind of harassment and fabrication of hit pieces, but their identity is also based on doing these awful things publicly and then flatly denying that they did anything at all. They commit a murder on Main Street and then, with blood on their hands, say with no humor that they have no idea who committed the crime. And the sheer confidence of lying that blatantly works sometimes, so I think it's important to make note of moments like that. But again, I want to come back to this Gamergate tactic of total deconstruction of every possible aspect of their target. They had done it before, in fact many times. It was, after all, one of the movement's core tactics. While it was possible for them, and they do, to be fair, do it, to rhetorically engage with the underlying ideological foundations for whatever they want to take down, that's not enough. In part, I think it's clearly because they lack the resources to do so, in a meaningful way at least, and that this focus on another outside aspect is a way of distracting from that. But I think that it also, maybe, stems from a simple desire to exert power and influence. In the twisted justice system of Gamergate, the moment someone does something deemed too SJW, they forfeit their right not to have their life ruined. And when people point out the awfulness of this idea of extreme ideological retribution, Gamergaters will bring up certain things of maybe questionable judgment that the subject had done in the past. Which is wild, right? We've all done stupid things, and I say that not in the way that people defending those accused of some terrible crime say it, like, yeah, we've all done bad things, but I think your thing is a lot worse. I mean it literally just that everyone has had a bad take online or something to that effect. And the idea that someone messing up in that kind of a way justifies you doing everything within your power to destroy them is real rich, coming from the ideology whose entire movement is just one giant bad take. I'd even say that me engaging with this idea, though, of the severity of the things that the people Gamergaters attack have done, is playing into their hands, justifying something inherently dishonest. Tony didn't do anything that they could even point out, and if they had, they would have known. Kotaku in Action and other groups investigated their accounts across the internet, and all they could find was political opinions that they disagreed with, and identities they hated. They had nothing, and yet nothing was more than enough justification. This entire video, I've been, essentially, fighting anti-SJWs on their own terms. I've responded to their posts, debunked their claims, and refuted their ideology, but I haven't, yet, left room for myself to support my side in all of this. And that's a pretty big oversight on my part, because it is really important to support my side and talk about why this change of wiki policy was a good thing, not just to prove that it isn't bad. As we discussed earlier, from a wiki perspective, the change was only logical as a response to the ineffectiveness of the policy that was in place at communicating the nuance in gender and pronouns. Despite the fact that some people seem to be under the impression that use of pronouns here is somehow politically motivated, it's been shown by the games and words of the developers themselves to be a necessary measure based upon the sometimes complicated identities presented in the games the wiki is about. But I think that even trying to justify this decision as being factual or, by some extension, consistent with the goals of a wiki is something that can only take us so far. For one, it's easy to forget that facts aren't exactly 100% factual. For one, as we've seen today, we're always constrained by the confines of language, which often puts caps on our ability to convey nuance in brief. But even conceding that we'll never escape language, an idea I'm basically inclined to believe, it's impossible to convey these relative truths truly objectively. Even with a wiki, where the intention is to be as factual as possible, judgments still have to be made. How are you going to lay out the page? How will you arrange information? What information will get its own subcategories or hyperlinks? All of these decisions will impact how information is distributed and what information will be prioritized in this distribution, making them subjective judgments, which complicates the idea of a purely factual environment. Despite the idea that anti-SJWs would like it to appear that there is a solid line between fact and subjective decision, it's much more complicated than that. And such an adamant refusal to engage with or even acknowledge that nuance for ideas of perfect factualness, sure, but also for the series as a whole, is preventing conversations that would lead to more responsible consumption of these games and a more healthy discourse around them. In my interview with Tony, they told me something that really stuck with me in all of this. I think that having uncomfortable conversations about these things is how the community matures, and I think we can see that reflected in how the official media is written and localized. What pronouns someone uses and how they identify are different subjects, but people still confuse the two, so they are inextricably linked. The way that a trans character, Villia, was handled in Breath of the Wild is pitiful and regressive, but I think if Nintendo were to decide to include characters with the same identities as Fi and Villia in something like 10 years, for instance, the way that they are approached would be different and ideally more respectful to their identities. Nintendo do account for the feedback from the fandom, and how these characters are treated now by the official source is representative of where the collective Zelda community is on the subject of gender variant and transgender characters. This extends beyond even our own personal analysis of and thoughts on these things. It's a question of whether or not we want to have more responsible media, and the way to do that is not to silence people who offer criticism of that media. Better sentiments and attitudes in the future aren't guaranteed and are even being actively prevented by the efforts of opponents of discourse. And the fight for even tiny steps isn't done. The wiki has currently adopted a compromise policy of inferring gender from pronouns, but as Tony told me, it's a faulty premise as it is now, and some people who were initially in opposition to it later realized. Unfortunately, the alternative they proposed was to change gender for sex, which didn't solve the issue at hand, and so it never went anywhere. There's also a horrible precedent with Sheik, where we have historically used X, parenthetically, disguised as Y, that people like to bring out now and again as a solution of sorts, even if the original instance was in relation to race and not gender. I don't think that either of those are meaningful solutions, so if something were to change, the long-term option must be to identify by pronouns. They continued, "These subjects are clearly being broached, but until we can have honest conversations about these things without it being dismissed as a political move, we're not going to look at these works with the dignity they deserve." Once again, thank you so much to Editor-in-Chief Tony for speaking to me on this subject. This video really couldn't have been made in the way it was without their insight. Special thanks also to the administrators of the ZU forums for answering my questions. Ich werde dir unangenehm auffallen,